The world without textiles would not have material or quantitative knowledge or these and much more. Hafting, hunting, herding, reining, sledding, plowing, fishing, boating, rigging, hoisting, climbing, scaffolding, gathering, carrying, storing, securing, sealing, packaging, drive bands, vehicles, factories, yurts, tents, teepees, suturing, stents, grafts, bandaging, spacesuits. These were some of the words introducing the importance of textiles at the exhibition Textiles, the Art of Mankind, which was on view at the Fashion and Textile Museum in London until just last Sunday. I was thankfully lucky enough to be able to visit it right before it closed upon my arrival back to London after quite a long trip to South America to do research for my own book and other research projects. And so today, really, I want to share some of my thoughts about the exhibition. I want to, of course, put my fashion historian hat on and my educator hat on, and hopefully also my curator hat on to try to understand not only what I loved about the exhibition, but also the challenges I saw in it, and then maybe also even suggest some of the ideas that I have to make these kinds of exhibitions even better. I must say, though, that I love visiting museums. I love seeing objects displayed in museums, especially when they are textile objects. So I am, of course, very biased. But if you know me, if you know my work, if you know anything of what we do here at Redressing Fashion, you probably also know that I have a very specific agenda when it comes to the stories and the narratives that we tell about fashion. And that, of course, is shaping how I see and how I speak about this exhibition. That being said, welcome back to Redressing Fashion. Have you ever imagined fashion being as diverse as human culture? Have you ever dreamed of a respectful, ethical, and socially just fashion industry? Have you ever envisioned sustainability being at the core of the entire fashion system? This is your host, Laura Beltrán-Rubio. I'm a fashion curator, researcher, and educator. My mission is to translate scholarly insights into actionable strategies that we can all take to reshape how we create, wear, and think about fashion. So find a comfortable seat, brew some tea, and open your notebook as you join me in the quest for redressing fashion. So, the exhibition Textiles, the Art of Mankind, was curated by Mary Schoser, and the main aim, according to the exhibition website, was to celebrate the ancient and deep entanglement between textiles, people, and our world. Both the exhibition website and the wall texts highlight the close relationship between the beauty of textiles and human ingenuity, and the exhibition offered, quote, a rare chance to see objects never before exhibited in the UK, including a vibrant textile from Panama depicting a mermaid to represent fertility, a stunning wall hanging reflecting on Sardinia's history of occupation, or an ingenious ceremonial bag shaped like a human hand suggesting a welcome gesture. Mary Schoser, the curator of this exhibition, has also published several books, among which one of them is titled Textiles, the Art of Mankind, which was published in 2012. I have not read the book, but I am willing to guess that the exhibition is very likely based on the research and even the writing that Mary did for this book. The exhibition was very likely a sort of iteration of many of the ideas that she presented in the book. And I would say that perhaps even some of the objects that are featured in the exhibition or that were featured in the exhibition were probably also featured as case studies or examples in the book. The one thing that I want to highlight about the book, though, is that it was published in 2012. And when I realized that date in the book, a lot of the things in the exhibition also make sense, especially if the exhibition was indeed made or based on the research done for this book. Some of the stories and some of the word choices I personally consider a little bit outdated, and outdated, especially in the sense that we have moved past many of the very canonical, very hegemonic narratives that were presented in the exhibition. But again, if this is based in older scholarship, I can kind of understand why it wasn't present there. That doesn't mean, though, that curators and museums and everyone else who's involved in exhibition making doesn't have an important responsibility in, trying to update the knowledge that they are sharing, and especially sharing with the public on the histories that they're telling. But we'll get there in a bit. First of all, I want to talk about the exhibition itself. It was divided into 10 sections, starting with the base materials for textiles and needles, which I guess would be the basic tools that we use and have used for millennia to create textiles. The first floor had the first two sections on material and needles, and then I think 3 more sections where they explored a bit of the tension between individuals and society precisely through textiles and through textile making and through the themes of individuality and identity. And I think a little bit of the tension between what it is to express your individual identity versus what it is to express and maybe to fit in a way into collective identities. The symbolism of animals in particular, I thought was very interesting to see because we could see the many ways in which animals inspire textiles and in which animals become an important aspect of human life for various reasons. And so they are featured in textiles in different ways. We have textiles that had very figurative views or representations of animals that were very clear to see, some others that had more abstracted views of the animals, and then we even had a collection of small animal figurines made of textiles. So there are different ways in which animals kind of are created through textiles, and I actually thought that was very interesting to see, and it's something that I don't know, maybe it is discussed frequently with textiles, but it was nice to see the kind of visual comparisons that were being made with the objects themselves. The second floor went more into the sort of general considerations about textiles and maybe human thought. So it was a little bit more maybe technical and philosophical in a way. So it looked at the creation and representation of abstract ideas in textiles. And it also even inquired on the potential of textiles to show complex mathematical and scientific concepts, or even embody these mathematical and scientific concepts. There was even a mention to Jacquard looms as the first computer, and again, this exploration of textiles in relation to computing, to algorithmic processes, algorithmic thought, just the repetition of algorithms, which I personally think is one of the most interesting things to see about textiles. This is definitely not something new that the exhibition was doing, but it's always interesting to see that, and it's always interesting to see how different people engage with it, but then also how different objects kind of showcase that. And here we had a diversity of objects from diverse cultures, which I think made it even more interesting. And then the final 2 sections were dedicated to the political and ecological aspects of textiles that have become, I think, increasingly popular in recent years. We have seen more and more conversations about the political power of textiles in representing certain things, in helping us exert our activism through not just wearing but making the textiles, but then also in bringing communities together, and in expressing our identity, which I honestly think it's a very political thing from the very beginning. From just the idea of identity, I would say, is a political thing. And then in these 2 sections, there were some mentions to sustainability or like circularity in fashion, to the practices of reusing and repurposing textiles in different ways, and then also the use of textiles for resistance, which again is something that I think we have become more and more aware as a society recently, but it has always been there. And then finally, there was a sort of annex, so to speak, to the exhibition with Lynn Setterington's work under the title of Connecting Threads. And so Setterington has done a fantastic job of kind of going or meeting with different communities around the world and kind of bringing them together through textile making. And so her works of art are end up being the reflection of broader community dynamics, and they often try to highlight especially marginalized communities and how they struggle in our present day world. So it was actually pretty nice to see that the way in which it was laid out was on the walls around the table where the activities or certain activities like learning activities could be held. And so among other things there were pencils and other materials to color there. I think there might have been some questionnaires, but I'm not really sure anymore. But that was kind of a nice space and an interesting set of works to kind of bring together everything that was shown in the exhibition before. I certainly appreciated the opportunity to view the textiles. I definitely, as a fashion and textile historian, I certainly appreciate the importance of textiles in history and for humanity across cultures, across the world, across time periods. And so the main aim of the exhibition, which is to kind of connect the direct link between humanity and textiles, is something that totally makes sense to me. And I think in many ways, it was highlighted in the exhibition. It was showcased in the exhibition beautifully through the objects. However, I have some issues with the more specific stories that were told in the exhibition, and especially I think with the language and the terms in which these stories and the artists behind these stories were introduced. So that's, I think, what I want to talk about next, a little bit of what I liked and what I struggled with in the exhibition. But let's start with what I liked. And more than what I liked, what I think worked best in the exhibition. The textiles themselves were absolutely amazing. They were beautiful, beautiful. I could have spent many, many more hours looking at them, and honestly, I wish I had had time to go to the exhibition before the summer, before I left on my extended research trip, to be able to see it at least twice with some space between the two visits because the pieces were absolutely gorgeous. I also really like to, when I visit exhibitions, kind of stop for a little bit and see how people are engaging with the exhibition, try to see what they're talking about, what they are, like, what their comments are, what their reactions are. And judging by the people that I saw while I was visiting the exhibition, just walking through the galleries, I would say that many of them also really appreciated the beauty of the textiles. And you could see them trying to go and like look into the details, maybe make connections between the different pieces that they were looking at. And that I think was beautiful to see. And that I also think is one of the main or most important, I think, powers of textiles themselves. They speak to us in very personal ways, and their own materiality, their own beauty draws the attention of people. And so it was really nice to see that in action in the exhibition. I really also enjoyed the visual conversations between different pieces in the exhibition, the way in which the different objects were kind of laid out. In this section about individuality, there was a common thread with shells and kind of appliques of luminescent materials or light reflective materials that I think was very interesting, especially to see how different cultures kind of apply them in their own ways and create their own textiles, which reflect their own cultural principles. And I think this was one of the main aims of the exhibition, to show all of these shared kind of values, but also in a way shared results, products of textiles across cultures. And I think that worked out really well. The objects themselves also came from the ethnographic collection at the University of California, Davis, which I think is interesting in and of itself because it kind of points back to the personal history of the curator who studied this collection also with the founder of the collection, who was Joan C. Stab. And it was through this collection, or at least partially through this collection, that her interest in textiles developed when she was an undergraduate student at UC Davis. And so even seeing those connections between the personal history of the curator of the exhibition and then the broader histories of mankind, I think are interesting to think about. Although this is a connection that I am making now after having kind of researched a little bit more about the exhibition and the curator. I'm not really sure that was necessarily evident in the exhibition, but I think it's an interesting aspect to maybe think about. And then we could also talk about the whole idea of an ethnographic textile collection, what they mean, how closely connected they are to imperialism and colonialism, and even just the creation, or in a way, the manufacturing of ideas, for example, of race, of culture, that we could get into, but that's not the purpose of this podcast, so I'm going to spare you of that. And actually, this is a topic that I am really interested in, that I have considered as part of my research briefly, and I might actually be interested in talking more about it in a different podcast episode, hopefully with someone who knows this topic much better than I do. So if you are this person, or if you know someone who is an expert in ethnographic collections and how they kind of work in the creation of art and fashion and the human races and everything else, please let me know. Please reach out. Maybe we can find a time to talk. But anyway, back to the exhibition. And to recap a little bit, what I liked the most were the objects themselves. And I think this attempt to show how textiles are just one of the most amazing expressions of human creativity around the world. And I think maybe also making some parallels between how different cultures have approached the making on textiles that results in either shared impulses and techniques, but also in shared end results and visual results. What I struggled with the most, I think, was the language. There were several moments where the terminology made me kind of itch. Or made my brain itch in a way, just because it didn't sound right. And so one of them, I think that was the first thing that I caught was, and especially because there was a beautiful piece right in front of the kind of passage into the second section of the exhibition, and the main galleries of the exhibition, where one of their works of art was just framed right in front of the entrance, sort of. And it's the terminology used to name people of Guna Dule communities. They were simply called Guna Indians, which is not exactly the term that they as a community prefer. And it also reproduces the naming conventions that stem from Spanish colonialism. And so unfortunately, these naming practices, and not just in the case of the Gunadule, have endured until today. And so I think there was a lack of maybe engagement with new, I don't know if scholarship necessarily, but like with new conventions, especially of naming, especially indigenous people, which is tremendously complex, very political, also problematic, but very, very, very important in the world that we live in today. So that's one thing. This also is making me think about other communities that are misnamed in the exhibition that I just didn't catch, mostly because I am not an expert in anything beyond some of Latin America and some indigenous cultures of the Americas. And so yeah, that just it just makes me uncomfortable. And naming, I think, is very important. And so, yeah, that's one of the things where I was like, oh, we could have done this better. And then speaking of naming, although a different kind of naming, it's also the naming of the people, the creators of the textiles exhibited. For the most part, I would say that the trend in the exhibition was to name European makers as makers, or sometimes more specific terms, and then anyone who was not European or like non-white European, white North American, Euro North American were called artisans. With the exception, I think, of Tibetan tailors, there were Guatemalan weavers and I believe Peruvian embroiderers or something like that, or maybe even Guna Indian embroiderer, that was the term, which I mean, other than the embroiderer, it doesn't make any sense. But in general, everyone who was non Western was named artisan. And most Europeans were called makers. And so here again, it's reproducing this hierarchy that was created at some point. I mean, it is, I think, the legacy of colonization for sure, but it was probably created at some point towards the 19th century, maybe even into the 20th century. That kind of separates the Western artist or designer from the non-Western everything else. And so by extending this division and this categorization, which again is entirely fabricated, I think the exhibition was even kind of contradicting its own purpose of showing how universal, in a way, textiles really are. And then there were some other kind of minor canonical stories, which maybe should have been revisited a little bit. The one that I can think about is of the Singer machine, which was introduced in the exhibition as the first global commodity, when in reality, there had been other global commodities that preceded it, unfortunately, as a result of colonialism, but cochineal, red dye from Mexico, cotton, chocolate, silk, tobacco, those were global commodities as well. And they existed centuries before the Singer sewing machine. And so, again, perhaps this is also based on a more recent, modern centric history of fashion and textiles, which maybe needs to be revised a little bit at this point. There were several mixed opportunities in the exhibition, and I think beyond just explaining where I felt uncomfortable in the exhibition or where I think fashion and or in this case textile history narratives should have been expanded, I think there were many places where with just little tweaks a lot more could have been done to really show the diversity of textiles and the importance of textiles to humankind. Some of these missed opportunities are, first of all, engaging with textiles as collective forms of making and knowledge recording and knowledge sharing before the last little section of the exhibition, where they talked about textiles as community making, but then that's something that happens and has been happening for millennia as well. And I think, for example, when we talk about historical textiles or what some call antique textiles that are millennia old, is that we don't know the name of their maker. But usually we should even think about it as their makers in plural, because it was often more than one person involved in making the textile. If not the final textile piece, at least the different stages of the textile making process were often made by different people. And so it's, in a way, textiles are always the result of many people coming together to make this one object, whether it's at the same time or at different times. But like, textiles are community, and I don't know, I think there was a missed opportunity in the exhibition to think that through a little bit more and explore it a little bit more throughout the exhibition instead of just waiting to this last section on Better Together. There were also a couple of instances where copying was introduced and in different ways. And I also think that this copying could have been better used to explore textiles as a product of culture, and then also textiles within human societies, but then also within the geopolitics and even the broader histories of humanity. So one of them is back to the Gunadule people. There were several molas throughout the exhibition, and those are the characteristic textiles made by the Gunadule. And I'm actually going to link some resources about them to the show notes in case you're interested in exploring them further. But alongside the molas, there were some printed textiles made in the United States that were called molas, but they are not molas. Maybe they are imitating the pattern, but because they are not made using the techniques to make molas, then I don't think we can call them that. But like even beyond the naming, I think this was a missed opportunity to think about cultural extractivism, cultural appropriation, racial plagiarism, and just these very imbalanced dynamics in copying in textiles that happen, especially when it comes to different people of different racial, ethnic, social backgrounds. But then it also happens in other parts of the textile industry, and we see it all the time. And so I think this was a missed opportunity to engage with a little bit of that. And then there was another instance of copying, which I thought was also interesting, is the recreation of a quote unquote Peruvian textile, which I suppose, or by the way it looked, I can say it was an Andean textile, not necessarily Peruvian. That's not what I would call it. So again, back to terminology, back to language. But the thing that I found the most disturbing about this particular recreation was that it was made by a white woman in Leiden, and that completely decontextualizes the textile from the Andes and from the Andean people that would have made it. And so just showing it there as an example of Peruvian textile creativity, or the Andean textile primacy is what I would call it, didn't make a lot of sense. And we can talk about this at some other point. I have written about it in some of my publications. I do think that recreations are excellent tools for museums when used correctly, and if used correctly as educational tools. But if you just put the thing there, just drop it as a sort of proxy for what it's recreating, it just, I personally think it's pointless. So those were two of the issues I think with copying that I thought were probably missed opportunities to engage with these broader themes in textile making and just textiles in general in the exhibition. And then another missed opportunity I saw in the mention of indigo, and there were a few objects made with indigo, but when introduced, there was no mention, absolutely no mention, to either colonialism or perhaps more importantly, the enslavement of thousands of people, especially in North America, that basically grew and cropped indigo for the world markets. And this is, yes, it is an unfortunate part of human history, but it is a part of human history, and textiles carry it. Textiles are completely entangled with the histories of colonialism and enslavement. And so, again, missed opportunity to explore, even mention these other histories of textiles in the exhibition. And I think just by using one object and kind of look at it between the lines or against the bias grain or whichever metaphor you like, I think these objects help us unpick the stories, the canonical stories of fashion as well. And that was a missed opportunity. And then the last thing I would say was thinking about textile making as a science in and of itself, and not textile making as something that carries science with it. This was kind of there, but I thought it could have been pushed further a little bit more. Textiles as science and textiles as computing, like reclaiming the scientific power of textiles, if that makes sense. And then finally, putting my curator hat on. If I had to curate this exhibition again, or suggest ways of improving it, this is what I would do. And actually, I want to use this opportunity to maybe have this last part of putting my curator hat on, to think about ways to improve the exhibition. I think those are going to be my 3 little things of the day. If you have watched this podcast, and if you don't, I like to end with 3 little things, 3 little takeaways, or 3 little strategies, reflecting back on what has been said throughout the episode. So I think these are my 3 little things for today. 3 little things that I would do different if I were to present this exhibition somewhere else. Number 1, engage with the communities whose textiles are featured in the exhibition to ensure better representation and especially better naming. to better understand their textile practices, to better understand their preferences, how they view the making of textiles, if they view themselves as artists or artisans or a collective or knowledge keepers or anything else. And then also, of course, the more basic conventions of how they want to be called. I think that would be number one, to avoid recurring and perpetuating many of the practices that were instituted with colonialism that unfortunately, and whether we like it or not, shape many of the ways in which we do things as simple as name something today. The second one would be to question the name and adjectives that are attached to textiles, and well, and other objects as well, but especially to textiles in this exhibition. Also question how they are linked to different cultures. So what I was saying about everything European or Euro North American being attached to makers, and everything non-European or non-Euro North American being called artisans or made by artisans. I think I would try to push back against that. And actually, if the title of the exhibition is The Art of Mankind, and we'll get back to that, why not simply call them all artists, at least for the sake of this exhibition? I know that there's a lot that can be said about the differences between artist and artisan and artist and designer and artist and maker, but if this is about textiles as art, why not just use the word artist? And then the third one is reconsidering the name of the exhibition. Because yes, it does feel very strange to talk about mankind when women are often and most directly associated with the creation of textiles, both in the canonical histories that we hear about textiles and in the present day in contemporary practices. This is, of course, not true. There have been a lot of men too who have created textiles throughout the history of humankind, but they tend to be associated with women. And so, in a way, naming it mankind makes sense as a strategy to, show us that it's not just women, but then also it makes us think that it's just men who are doing whatever it is that they're doing with these textiles. And then the thing here is that we have humanity. It is right there, it is readily available. Why use mankind instead of humanity? And actually, in thinking about the exhibition as a whole and even the themes that it had and the connections that it made, I perhaps would even replace it by culture. Culture feels a little bit less anthropocentric than humankind or humanity, much less patriarchal than mankind. But I think it also, when we think about culture, we can also start thinking about not just the people, but the place, the more than human kin, the social dynamics, even the technologies, the economic systems that shape the creation of textiles and that shape human behavior, and vice versa, are shaped by human behavior and by textiles. And so, I don't know, I perhaps would lean to renaming the exhibition to call it maybe Textiles the Art of Culture or Textiles Art and Culture or something like that. This, of course, is just a thought that I'm having right now. But I would certainly reconsider the title. Yes. I think with that, and very abruptly, we've come to an end today. I do want to say that I really enjoyed viewing the exhibition. I really enjoyed viewing the pieces in this exhibition, and it was indeed a treat to get so many objects from all across the world from the collection of UC Davies and have them in London to be able to see them for a while. I also think it is important to take items out of collections that are not often on view and make them available for other people to view them. I would love, however, this exhibition to reach people in the communities represented, which I'm not sure it has been done. I'm not sure if this is a traveling exhibition. I should have done more of my research. I'm not sure if this is a traveling exhibition that's visiting several parts of the world as part of its itinerary. But yeah, it was a treat to see it. And it is a treat to be here talking about exhibitions, because I do love museums, I do love exhibitions. And now that I am starting a new chapter of my life outside of academia or at the margins of academia, I definitely want to start curating more and going back to some of my projects in curating. So, this will not be the last time that you hear me talking about an exhibition, and hopefully, at some point, you will hear me talking about my very own exhibitions. But I do have quite a lot of work to do before we get there. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Please, please, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, subscribe to my newsletter, watch my YouTube channel to see more snippets of information beyond these longer podcast episodes. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate you. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you saw the exhibition actually, if you have any thoughts, and I will see you again in 2 weeks with a brand new guest that I will be interviewing very soon. Bye bye.